Well, the engine is now out of the stand and ready to be transferred to the mount. Okay. Back sort of in place, kinda, and the front sort of in place, kinda. Wires are not exactly where we want them, but okay, I'm gonna put the front motor mount bolt in place first. Just put that through the hole to hold that while I put the rear one in, and the rear one is the stud that has the slot end. Slide the screw in to lift the back of the engine slightly. That slid in place, not on either end. See, I have a wrench here. I'll bolt it securely in. I'm not going to completely install the engine right away. Things like the clutch cable, and the gear shift, and the primary chain I'm not going to connect right away. I'm very confident that the engine's going to start and run fine, but just in case there are issues that need to be solved and the engine does have to come back out, I'll leave those things undone until we confirm that the engine starts, runs, and the charging system puts out voltage to charge the battery. Then we can put the primary chain and the clutch cable and gear shift, connect them all up, and take this machine for a drive and make sure the transmission works. I'll just make sure the transmission is neutral before we try to start it. That way we're not spinning over the transmission gears, all of the transmission gears. We'll be spinning over the input shaft because we won't have the clutch disengaged. This front mount is a lot easier to get at in this machine with the top removed, even just without the cooling shroud not on the engine. And I have left the cooling shroud off up to this point for two reasons. It's easier to put the engine in without the cooling shroud. And I also want to be able to see the fan to make sure the engine is turning over forward and reverse. So I may run the engine for a very brief period without the cooling shroud, but I definitely wouldn't recommend running it for any extended period of time with the cooling shroud off of it. Bolt is sufficiently tight for our purposes. So I'll run the battery cable, negative battery cable. I'm just going to run it underneath the fan duct here. There. So that's the battery negative cable, which will go under one of our transmission mount studs, on the transmission mount stud. So I need the right wrench for that. And we'll also need the ground wire from the Dynastart, which is here. So both grounds go to this stud, actually. Yes, I'm going to use this stud. So one ground wire, the other ground wire. The washer back on. Back on the same way it was. And before I connect the fuel tank, I'll make sure, well, I'll test the engine to make sure it's going to crank over and forward and reverse, and there is spark at the spark plug before we get any fuel anywhere near this. So I can do wires while I'm here. Continue doing wires. And these wire ties are a little bit not correct, so we'll connect our black wire to our black wire, and our red wire to our red wire on the new points. And did I tighten that? Yes, I was talking when I tightened it. So now we'll take our little dust cap off. Take the choke slide and the throttle slide. The throttle slide has a keyway in it to lock with the pin in there. So make sure that's lined up. So the throttle slide slides in, and then the top disc, you can't see it from where the camera is, but the top disc has a tab on it. It goes into a cutaway on the side of the top of the carburetor. So that's the choke and the throttle hooked up. I've got my wound around this cable, so I'll just unwind that a little bit. That's caught underneath the ground wire. I think that will be fine. I wouldn't leave it there if this engine was going to be in here for any length of time, but it's for testing purposes. And I honestly don't use the choke very much anyway. So now we need our control box. Be right back. Change the camera angle a little bit to hopefully give you a little better view of what I'm doing next. We have our control box, which we previously tested, and at that point we tested fine. So the first thing we need to do, or I'm going to do, is connect the positive battery cable here up to the 5130 terminal on the control box. That is, of course, our battery wire in, and this sits like this. So this wire in so that it leads out correctly. It's normally fed through the grommet here, which I'm not going to concern myself with today because this cable does not belong with this control box. I'm going to make sure I get everything I want to attach to this terminal onto the screw. cable is reluctant here. There we go. So the positive battery output to the dash, the wire is here, and this is the cable that goes directly to the battery. So we want to make sure this screw is tight, and we want to make sure nothing's touching ground here, because this is positive right to the battery, and this will be grounded directly to the battery. That would be a direct short if we weren't careful. Just going to make sure that the battery cable is pulled through the front here. Reach under the seat. Reach under the seat. Battery cable comes up into the battery box. There we go. Okay, so I'm going to put this in place and put the screw in it that holds it in place. Now we need, well, I can do this first, I guess. You can see where I am in the corner here. Okay, so we have all the wires that come from the control box to be connected to the wires that go to the dash. Right here. So we have one wire here that says reverse indicator on it, if you recall. That one's not used in this machine. So we'll connect our positive wire to the positive wire that goes to the dash. Then we have a black wire for our ignition system. It goes to our black wire for our ignition system. Then we have a blue wire for our generator light. Just make sure they're pushed securely in there. Then we have a gray wire which goes to the white wire leading to the front. Then we have a brown wire which connects in my test machine to a purple wire, which would be a brown wire in Penguin. Looks like I'm doing a bit of some braiding or something here. The wire's all twisted up. So in this outfit, we have a purple wire connected to a brown wire. There should be brown to brown in your machine. And then we have a yellow wire for our neutral indicator light that, let's see, I'm not going to concern myself with. Sorry for a shot of my shoulder. The wire's over there, it's out of harm's way since the primary chain is not on. So those are all of the wires except the neutral indicator light, which we don't need to start and run the machine, connected, at least from the black box to the dash. Just spinning the output sprocket of the engine over to make sure it's in neutral. And now we get to connect this harness to this set of terminals. I'm going to take all of these nuts and washers off of here again. And carefully make sure that all of the wires in my right hand here go in their correct places in this control box. Should be a flat washer and lock washer on each terminal. Make sure I take them all off. And then there are several ways to make sure, or several checks, I guess, several things to watch when you put these wires on to make sure they're in the right place. I actually recently bought a Penguin where the wires had been installed incorrectly And the way I spotted it was, unfortunately, I noticed a melted wire. But when I looked, I could see why the wire was melted. I could see where the problem was. Because something didn't look right. Oh, I dropped a washer. I better fish that out before I finish, since we're dealing with electricity. Is my screwdriver magnetic enough there? Okay, we got the washer out. Okay, so there's several ways to make sure these are connected correctly. One is that the terminals in here on the wires are marked. The terminals on the block are marked. And these terminals here are marked. Some on the underside, but because the wires have been left in the grommets, they should be in the correct order to line up with all of these. And where there are two wires that look like they overlap, the way to make sure you don't put them on swapped is the wires they mate with all come from the same side. So this wire comes in between the stud and the front of the machine, so the wire for it is the same. The stud is here, the wire is in front of it. The next one, the wire comes in behind the stud. The stud is closer to the front of the machine, and then this one, the stud is here, the wire comes in front of that. So in that case, we want this wire first, then this wire goes here because it matches, and this wire goes there because it matches. So it's hard to see from the angle the camera's at, but I'll go along here, make sure I put the wires all in the right places. And of course you can't go by the wire color since most of them are black. There's one lonely red one here, and there is one that's slightly different. This wire here, this smaller black one, it doesn't have a ring terminal on it. It has a spade terminal, an open terminal, and so does the wire it mates with. So if you watch what you're doing, there are ways to make sure the wires go on correctly. Hopefully the machine you're working on, someone hasn't decided that it's easier to cut the wires, because it may be easier to take it apart by cutting the wires, but it sure doesn't make putting it back together any fun. So all the wires are on, so they appear to match just by looking at them, even if you don't know what the letters mean. So now we can put some nuts and washers back on. I'll start at each end so the harness can't go anywhere. Flat washer, lock washer, and nut. And a couple of flat washers, a couple of lock washers, and a couple of nuts. Now, with all the hardware on the engine being in British standard sizes, I've been told that the hardware in the control box is all metric. I did notice that these nuts are nicely tightened by a 9mm socket. So is the nut on the front of the right-hand side cover, and it's a British standard, so. Just continue on with washers and nuts. Washer, washer, nut. And we're getting there. This is the one that's not on a ring terminal, so it's a little reluctant to sit exactly where it belongs. Well, it's tightened, so I'll just make sure it's done last, and I'll just have to go get my 9mm socket, ratchet. Tighten these down. That wire matches with that one with this one with the one underneath it. The red one matches to the red one. That one's matched, that one's matched, that one's matched, that one's matched. Okay, I'm ready to tighten those down. So 9mm socket and 1/4 inch drive ratchet, turning the right direction. And they are small studs, so I need to go Magilla on these and break them. This control box isn't as clean as it could be, but it has been tested and it does work. Even though the coil is coming apart a little bit. Let's put this terminal correctly in its spot here. Hold these ends here in place as I tighten the nut, so you can't squirm out from underneath the washer. And again, no power connected up here, so. And this one. Last one we've been looking for all along, the last one. This one better done with a nut driver instead of a ratchet. I'll leave that socket there. Okay, so the control box is connected to the engine, the ground from the control box, which is actually that wire there, is connected to the stud on the transmission, the ground wire for the battery, the negative for the battery is connected. We've got the throttle slide and choke slide in place. We've got a spark plug wire here. The spark plug is loose because we're going to be taking it out just to check for spark in a few moments, and I'll just get some tools out of the way. Now we need a battery and a test light. Actually, before I go to that, connecting the battery up. I'm going to go ahead and put the exhaust system in. These other parts out of the way here that we're not using. And I just have a regular Penguin exhaust system to set in place. I'm not going to worry about a gasket between the pipe and the flange on the exhaust here. Wiggle the exhaust and get the flange flat against the flange on the pipe, flat against the flange on the engine. And I'll get my handy dandy special wrench for that. So there's our pin spanner for tightening this nut on the exhaust. Engine's only temporarily being installed, but we might as well snug this down just to stop from rattling and keep it from being a huge exhaust leak. We have an exhaust system. Oh yes, battery. I'm just going to move the camera so you can get a look at how I do a quick test of the electrical system before we turn the key. I'm going to connect to the battery cables in the Penguin using booster cables so that if I have an issue and want to disconnect the battery quickly, it's a simple matter of just taking an alligator clip off of the battery. So I have my booster cables here. I'm going to connect this one. Positive over here. I might have to wiggle that and make a better connection. I'm not connected to the battery yet, but I'll leave this on the floor. Connect the battery cables, the booster cables, to the battery. And with the ignition switch turned off, I'm just going to test my test light by connecting it. I just have a regular 12 volt automotive test light. It's an unpowered light. I'll just connect it to my battery and make sure the light works, and the light works. So now what I want to do is check for short circuits or sticking relay. So right now the ignition switch is turned off, and so there shouldn't be anything drawing any power. So if I connect the test light between the battery cable, the booster cable, and the ground cable, there shouldn't be a complete circuit anywhere, so the light shouldn't come on. Because there isn't a complete circuit, as in a short circuit, or say if the key was turned on and the coil was drawing power because the points were closed, that would complete the circuit between our positive battery cable around through to our negative battery cable, and our test light would light. So just confirm that we're connected here. So if I connect to the positive battery cable, yes. Yes. Well, my light is in less than perfect here, but the light is not on. There's the light is on, the light is not on. Now if I reach across here and turn the ignition switch on, the test light should come on. me because the light on my dash is on, but my test light has decided to be temperamental at this juncture. So our generator light is on, but there isn't enough power going through to light this light. But the purpose of this was to check for shorts, and I don't see any. So there's no short circuit in the system, which is just, I like to do that, especially since I've had the stator for the Dynastart on this engine pretty much completely apart before I connect the battery up, and we find out the hard way by releasing the smoke that there's an issue. I test that way. So I'll move the camera back to the engine compartment and I'll connect this wire up. So now I will connect the negative battery cable with the ignition switch turned off to our battery cable in the machine. And there was no spark when I did that, so it's looking good now. I'll simply see if you can see the fan. So you can see our marked blade. I'm just going to see if the engine turns over and forward. Okay, it does. I'm glad to see that. Okay, so now with the ignition switch turned on, I have a switch here for the reverse. If I flip it, we should hear this solenoid click. It's clicking. So now the fan should turn the other way as I crank it in reverse. And we do see reverse. Now that I see the engine is cranking forward and reverse, I'm going to take the spark plug out just to make it easier for the engine to spin over. And I'm going to take a spark tester. Just a little spark tester. It's simply, you replace the spark plug with it outside of the engine so you can see if there's spark. And we have no fuel anywhere near this machine yet, so it's okay if we have an exposed spark. So we simply connect the spark plug wire to one end of this and ground it. And we want a gap between the conductors and this is an inexpensive spark tester, and it shows it. So now I'll just zoom in a little bit. Now we did check the points, and we checked the timing, so we should be fine here, but I'll just check it before I hook the fuel system up. So now as I crank the engine, we should see a spark there. This is forward, and I'll have to turn this so I can see it. I don't see spark there. Just close that gap a little bit. Try that again. No. The terminal on the end of this is terrible. This is not a great spark tester. Try reverse. Again, I can't see it when I'm trying to view. I'll just try something here. I'll try replacing my spark tester with the spark plug, and I would not recommend doing this at all if there's any fuel anywhere near the engine when you're doing this, because as we know, fuel and sparks, yeah, I can see on the spark plug this nice blue spark dancing there, so My spark tester leaves a lot to be desired, so I'm going to take a new spark plug. I use B7HS's. Install it. It's gapped to approximately 25 to 30 thou. And I'm just going to get a wrench to tighten that. My spark plug wrench is a little bit overkill here. Let's put this in snug. And we'll put our spark plug wire in place. I put it underneath the cables so that it is less likely to pop off. Now, I need to connect a fuel line from our tank. Oh, I zoomed in so I'll connect a fuel line from my temporary tank here to the banjo fitting, and the banjo fitting is loose. Just tighten that right where it is. Just snug it up. I don't usually have the banjo fitting pointed upwards, but the tank in this is in a different spot in the machine. I'll install a fuel line here with a fuel shutoff on it. I need some pliers for that clamp. Oh, we have a clamp on the line. Actually, that line is very loose on there. I'll have to get a different clamp. So the way I put the fuel line on is fuel line to a shutoff, to a filter, and then to the banjo fitting. That way the fuel can be shut off, so when the engine's not being run, just in case there's an issue with the inlet needle, we don't want the carb flooding over and the fuel tank emptying into the engine compartment. And if you decide you want to change the fuel filter, you can just shut the fuel off, change the fuel filter, the fuel valve back on. So I want a little better clamp on that. I have replaced the clamp on the fuel line. I put a worm gear clamp on it. I wasn't happy with the fit of the fuel line, so I should have found a smaller fuel line. Instead, I simply put a worm gear clamp on it, tightened it up. I've got fuel in the fuel tank, and I have the shutoff turned off, and I have removed the air filter, because the next thing I'm going to do is, well, the first thing I'm going to do is turn the fuel tap on, and we should see if the filter wasn't so high, perhaps. We should see fuel coming out of the fuel tank into the filter. That's off, that's on. I see fuel come into my fuel filter. I seem to have a fuel issue to start. I'll turn the fuel off. Disconnect the line right here. Of course, anytime you're working around fuel, you should avoid getting on your hands. You should avoid spilling it on the ground. And you should avoid sparks, of course. So I'm going to solve this issue and come back. And then I'll just tell you what I did. I think I found my fuel issue. The inlet to the valve is plugged with gunk. So I'm just going to blow that out with compressed air and put this all back together, and we Should be good to resume our hopefully engine startup. The inlet to our fuel valve is now clear of debris, so I'll reassemble and come right back. Well, now our camera can't see the fan. I'll just move the camera a little bit here. Hang on. Okay. Okay, not quite. Okay. There. Where was I? Oh, yes. So our fuel system is hooked up and we have fuel. And before we try to start the engine, we want to make sure there isn't a fuel system issue. So I'll turn the fuel on, and fuel comes into our fuel filter. It should go through the fuel filter to this line, through the banjo fitting, into the float bowl of the carburetor. And I see an issue. I see a drip here, so turn the fuel off. Hose clamp at the banjo fitting. Not as good as I thought it was, so I've replaced it. Feels tight now, so we'll turn the fuel on again. There may be fuel in the carburetor. Now I'll push the tickler button. Yes, there is fuel in the carburetor. So the reason the fuel filter isn't filling up is because when I tested the fuel line earlier, enough fuel got into the float bowl to fill the float bowl to the point where the float closed the inlet needle. So the inlet needle won't let any fuel into the float bowl, so no fuel can fill the filter. So I'll just let this sit here for a moment or two and watch and make sure no fuel appears out these two passages in the carburetor. That would be a sign of the inlet needle not holding fuel from entering the float bowl, and a sign that the carburetor is flooding over. So the carburetor sat with fuel turned on, and I don't see any flooding of the carburetor. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit here and pan to the right here. So now you can see the two passages in the bottom of the carburetor. So I'm going to push the tickler button down. The tickler button is here, and what it does is pushes the float down so the inlet needle can open so the carburetor can flood over. And what I want to see is a little bit of fuel come out here to prime the engine so it'll start quicker. So I'm just going to push and hold the tickler button until I see some fuel there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There we go. I can see a little bit of fuel has come out there. So I've released the tickler button. Now I'm going to put the air filter back on. So if the engine backfires when we're starting it, the backfire is contained in the air filter. So the air filter goes on with top up. We'll clip it on. We'll remove some extra tools here so nothing can fall and rattle and make extra noises. So here we go. We're going to turn the key and crank this engine over with fuel and spark for the first time since we've rebuilt it, and the first time for it in I don't know how long. So we'll just watch the fan here, make sure it turns forward, and we'll see what happens. Well, there's one little kick. I'll just give it a little more fuel. 1, 2, 3. And I did check the throttle to make sure the throttle slide wasn't sticking. So we'll try that again. And we have a muffler with a little bit of debris in it, so a little more fuel. Okay, so it sounds like it wants to run, and that was forward. So we'll flip our switch to reverse and try that. Sounds like our ignition timing is close for forward. Reverse. So now we'll go back to forward. And it's running in forward, and something you can't see from this camera angle is I watched the generator light in forward at least. Now we'll do it in reverse, and the generator light did go out after the engine sped up a little after it started, so I'll just try that again. Maybe a little fuel there. Generator light did go out in reverse. It sounds like my battery's getting a little weak. So that is a successful test of the engine. I want to do a little bit more with it. I'll put the fan shroud on it so I can run it a little longer. It's actually just starting to get warm to the touch, but I definitely don't want to overheat it. And we'll run it some more. And maybe put the chain, connect the shift linkage, and the neutral indicator to get it tied up out of the way. What else do we need? Chain, gear shift, clutch cable. We need to put a clutch cable in here, and then with the fan housing on, and I'll just start it and run it and make sure the throttle's not sticking or anything, and then we can maybe take it for a drive, make sure the transmission works. So that's good news right to now.